Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Since the Russia-Ukraine crisis began in late February, there's been growing public support in Finland for the Nordic country to join NATO. So how else is the ongoing conflict having an impact on Europe? How is the rest of the world being affected by the war? When and how can peace again return to the European continent? To discuss these issues, I'm honored to be joined today by Alexander Stubb, the former Prime Minister of Finland. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, Mr. Stubb. Thank you for joining us here. With the support for joining NATO in Finland and Sweden has surged to record levels since the Russia-Ukraine crisis began in late February. And they expected the two countries could join the alliance as soon as this summer. So first, please explain to us the change in public sentiment from supporting probably decades of neutrality to now considering joining the alliance.
Sure. Basically, support for NATO membership in Finland changed overnight on the 24th of February when Russia attacked Ukraine. It used to be about 50% in favor, 20% against. Now it is 68% in favor and 12% against. And when the Finnish political leadership will take a stand within the next few weeks, I predict that over 80% of the Finnish population will be wanting us to join NATO. And the reason is very simple. We're driven by rational fear, an aggressive imperialistic power with which we have 1,340 kilometers of border. Finns never want to be left alone again, like we were in World War II. That's why we're going to join NATO.
Well, public opinion obviously is very important in decision-making process. But I wonder, the decision finally will be made by the government or to a large extent swayed by the public opinion. After all, if you look at in the past decades of peace and stability relationship with Russia. But do you think people also consider, if we join NATO, there might be problems, with Russia?
Yeah, sure thing. I think, Finnish security policy has always been driven by two things: geography and history, right? So we can't do anything about our geography, 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia, but history we can sort of tweak in different directions. So in 1917, we were quick to declare independence. In 1944, we accepted peace. And then in 1989, afterwards, we decided to join the European Union. And this is sort of a natural continuum of that. I think the threats that we will be getting from Russia are pretty much hybrid and cyber linked. So there'll be a little bit of information war. And when President Zelensky was speaking to the Finnish parliament, the homepages of the Finnish Defense Ministry and Foreign Ministry were down, and there were violations of Finnish airspace. So these types of military technical threats will take place. But Finns are quite calm about it. We've survived worse things in life.
So can we say, obviously there's opposition from Russia, but whatever attitudes, whatever opposition from Russia, so basically Finland and Sweden will join NATO. It's like a sure thing. It's really an issue of timing, right?
Yeah, definitely. In the beginning of the conflict, I said it's not a matter of days or weeks, but months. But now I feel quite confident in saying that it's a matter of weeks. And by the latest, in the month of May, the parliament will recommend to our government and our president that we should join NATO, and then we will file an application. And I think Sweden will do the same thing. So when NATO has its summit in Madrid at the end of June, there will be a Finnish and Swedish NATO application, and we will join NATO by the end of this year.
Well, many says, much of this crisis in Ukraine has a lot to do with NATO's eastward expansion. 5 times it has, 5 times of expansion has increased its members from 16 to 30 with 1,000 kilometers eastward expansion almost to the doorstep of Russia. Some people say that played a role in the Russian attacking of Ukraine. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think your analysis is correct, but I say that it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I actually think that for Putin, it's more about Western liberal democratic values than about NATO membership itself. So he did not want to see Ukraine become European. And of course, now that he attacked, Ukraine has never been more European. So on one hand, it's about NATO membership, but it's also about ideology and values.
The public sentiment in Finland as well as in Sweden was very much influenced by the war in Ukraine. So speak of the impact, we take a look at the war and the ensuing sanctions in particular, what kind of impact they have created, not only on Russia, but also on Europe. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it has a big impact. I mean, and what people in China need to understand that what Europe and the West is doing with Russia at the moment is full and total isolation. So the instrument of war or the weapon that we have is sanctions. And that means that Russia will be politically, economically, financially, sports, culture, transport, and energy completely isolated. And the aim is not to hit the Russian people, but to hit the Russian regime. Now, then there are countries like Finland who do a lot of trade with Russia, say around 10%. A lot of our businesses have had to withdraw from Russia. And this is part of what I call the price of war or the lack of a peace dividend.
Well, of course, seems there's no lack of a political determination, on the leadership of European countries, the EU, for example, to impose sanctions on Russia, in particular in the energy sector. But then, there's the issue of, people would say whether the EU can wean itself, for example, off its dependence on Russian energy.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and you should understand that a lot of European countries have been dependent on Russian energy. And I've said it, a little bit simplifying that we've been a little bit naive because we've been dependent on American security. That will continue and that's fine, but also dependent on Russian energy. Now, the transition towards a green economy will be quicker after we sever energy ties with Russia. I'll take Finland as an example. We are dependent on Russian gas, but it's only 5 to 7% of our energy portfolio and only with the industry. So we, for instance, have used a lot of nuclear power and alternative renewable sources of energy. But yes, I do think that eventually Europe will decouple step by step away from Russian energy. And of course, the country that has most energy ties with Russia is Germany. But even there, we're starting to see a move away from Russian energy for understandable reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stu, thank you for that. Obviously, also the impact is not limited in the energy sector. I mean, in terms of like the public, the people, for example, in France, the election, the first round, people have noticed that, Le Pen, because of her paying attention basically to the cost of living, partly related probably to the inflation and to the high prices of oil and gas. So do you think there will be a problem in terms of, the public sentiment, in terms of whether, people are ready to also sacrifice?
Oh, definitely. And I think, what I keep on saying is that right now there is strong solidarity with Ukraine. But there will be a moment when people start, as we all do, looking at themselves, what's in it for me? And that's why I think it's very important for European leaders to communicate the price of war. And the price of war is higher inflation, higher food prices, higher energy prices, therefore higher heating prices and higher prices for driving cars. And this will have an impact. You mentioned the French elections. I actually thought that President Macron would ride into the Élysée and the presidency on the back of this war. But Marine Le Pen has been raising the issues of the cost of the war. And I think we'll see a similar type of a pattern in the discussion in the United States and the midterm elections, and of course then the presidential elections in 2 years. So these things matter. Important to communicate the price of war, and that price is high.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said, sanctions, of course, has I mean, its effects not only on the Russians, but also on the European countries. But then if you look at the purpose, of course, as you said, is to impose restrictions on the Russian government or the elite or the decision makers. But do you think the sanctions, 5 rounds of them already, do you think they will produce the desired results? For example, Russia will make a decision probably to withdraw or to lower down its military operation in Ukraine?
No, sanctions are always only a partial solution, right? And it depends on the scale of the sanctions. I think Russia now understands that it will be isolated and the sanctions will have a tremendous effect on its economy, on its welfare, and on its living standards. And of course, one of the biggest elements where the freezing of the assets of the Russian central bank, its currencies in the dollar, they have an impact on the day-to-day lives in Russia. But of course, in Russia, which is a very hierarchical leadership structure, it also then has to hit the governors, it has to hit the oligarchs and the rest of it. I do, however, think, unfortunately, that the only way in which we can get out of this conflict is a military solution. But that military solution comes from Ukrainians only. So sanctions are one part, but providing financial support and military equipment to the Ukrainians is another. So it's a more holistic view, if I may.
You said about most likely it's a military solution to conclude the war. That means probably more military support from the EU, NATO countries, the United States to Ukraine, and also economic assistance. So how long do you predict like the war will last? Americans are talking about years, if not decades.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. I mean, we always try to look from examples from history, and that Finland fought a winter war which lasted 105 days against the Soviet Union when they attacked us. We are now into almost day 50 in the war. I myself was mediating peace in the war in Georgia as foreign minister of Finland and chairman of the OSCE in 2008. That ceasefire took 5 days to broker, and now we're into day 50. So I predict that this war is going to be prolonged, and the reason is very simple. This war is too big for Putin to lose, and therefore he wants a big war and a big peace. And I think he's very surprised by the heroic efforts of the Ukrainians to push back the aggressor. And the reason for this is very simple. When your country is attacked, and when it's a question of your existence, you defend. But when you attack and you don't really know why you're attacking, you don't end up being a very strong military. So I think Putin has a problem. I think this will last for weeks, if not months.
As you said, for the Russians, probably the war is too big to lose. So obviously they are not ready, to lose in this war. Probably they will also enhance their operation, for example, to try to achieve their target, if not the entire country. Let's say the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbas region. Do you think they will make it?
It's hard to say. I think there are 3 options here. One is that Putin withdraws. 2 is that Ukraine is somehow split to an eastern flank and then a western flank. And the 3rd one is that Putin basically takes over all of Ukraine. I think the 3rd one is out of the question now. We've seen the military weakness of Russia in conventional warfare. They will not be able to do that. And I also think it's highly unlikely that Putin will draw completely. So therefore, the second solution, though I don't like it, is probably the more realistic one. How it's going to end up, I don't know. But I mean, we are looking at a new Bosnia type of a situation or a completely frozen conflict. And it's a very unfortunate state of affairs. But this is the reason that I don't see a ceasefire being likely, because the interests of President Zelensky and President Putin, of Russia and of Ukraine, are so far apart.
Let's take a break. We'll continue our discussion right after this. Do you think ultimately some say the United States probably will talk to Russia or EU on the NATO level, for example, to talk to Russia to, I don't know, to establish maybe a new security framework to make sure there is no hot war, for example, in the European continent. Is that a likely scenario?
It's an idealistic scenario. I'm afraid that we've gone beyond the point of no return. So if you recall, the European security structure was basically created with the Helsinki Accords in 1975. And the basic idea was that we all have territorial integrity and we are allowed to take our own security political decisions, and the landlines of Europe are set in stone. Now, of course, Russia has violated that 3 times since the end of the Cold War, first in Georgia, then with the Crimean Peninsula, and now in the eastern flanks of Ukraine. Russia always wanted to create a European security structure in its own image, with it at its center. And of course, coming from a small state, I can never let that happen. And the reason is very simple. Russia wants to have spheres of interest, a concert of big powers. It's this sort of nostalgic element of power politics. And we can't have any of that. So therefore, I don't see an imminent new European security structure. I more or less see on one side NATO and the European Union, and on the other side, Russia.
Mm-hmm. What about the future, say, EU-U.S. relationship? We know militarily, security-wise, obviously the EU has a lot of reliance or dependence on the United States, for example, the ongoing war. And now the European Union has made a strategic decision basically to cut off gradually maybe dependence on the energy security from Russia, probably turn to the United States for LNG, for example. Are there people who feel like, oh, we probably rely on the U.S. too much, not only militarily, but also energy security?
Well, they would have probably said that 6 weeks ago. But I think what Putin has done is he has revived the transatlantic partnership. It's almost like transatlantic partnership 2.0. A lot of us in Europe were a little bit afraid that the United States would disengage from Europe because of, an emerging sort of tension between China and the United States, and the focus was very much on China. Now the US has been, if not distracted, at least moved away from that, and it's focusing more on European security. And this has actually brought Europe and the United States closer to each other, and I think this will be continuing now for a few years to come.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned about China-EU relationship. They had a summit not long ago. During the summit, obviously for the Europeans, people like to talk. All the talk is about the Ukraine crisis. For the Chinese side, they would talk about where we can cooperation, where we can further our cooperation. Yeah. So there's this kind of discrepancy. So what do you make of that, of the relationship between China and the European Union?
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting relationship in the sense that China has realized that Europe is not anymore only a regulatory superpower. In other words, a power that legislates regulation to which you then have to adapt in order to get access to the market. The European Union has been an actor. It was so during the financial crisis. It was so during the asylum crisis. It has been during COVID. And of course, it's now also during the war in Ukraine. So China is probably starting to see the European Union more as a geopolitical player. And it'll be interesting to see how it acts and reacts. I have said many times that we should absolutely not isolate China or decouple. We should have China engaged. This is, of course, going to be complicated because of the Chinese-American relationship. But, these three sort of poles or powers have to cooperate in one way or another in order for the world to develop, the economy to develop, welfare to improve, and peace to be maintained. So that's why I think this sort of, tripolar relationship, China, the US, and the EU, is super interesting in the future.
Yeah, it's indeed a very interesting relationship. For the US, their basically characterization of this relationship is the competition, confrontation with a bit of cooperation. For the EU with China, previously China would say there's nothing geographical competition between China and the EU, right? It's strong economic partners. You find the potential in each other, huge potential. As you said, EU in the first 2 months, I believe, is the largest trading partner for China. So obviously it's critically important for China, EU is. And I think also China is important, the Chinese market, which is still growing for the EU countries over there. looking ahead, as you said, it's complicated. But for China, how to maneuver between, let's say, the United States, which is more probably, let's say, more competitive in terms of relationship. But for EU, there are some competition, but largely cooperation too.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think actually the conflict or the war in Ukraine will frame this relationship, because China has simply put three options. One is to pivot towards Russia, one is to pivot towards the West, and one is to oscillate between the two. And I actually think that China will oscillate between the two, because China cares about reputation, and of course China also cares about business. And it understands that there is a path dependency between China, the European Union, and the United States, and it doesn't want to have secondary sanctions. So it'll be a really careful balance to look for China. And as I've said, China is a very patient, emerging superpower in this world. We keep on saying that for China, 1 century is only a page in a book. So China is one of these powers that can slowly emerge from there. And everyone is seeing it and realizing it, that China is now one of the biggest players in the world. And I think the European Union and the United States take this into consideration. And the good thing, of course, with China is as well, unlike Russia, it hasn't been an aggressive power. It doesn't attack someone else. It has different ways of playing the game, but unlike Russia, it doesn't go for military conflict. And this is, I think, the key in the relationship. So I look at things from a perspective of international relations, and I really see big changes happening at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stubbe, you mentioned about, we are talking about China, EU, China-U.S. There are some concerns on the Chinese side. Chinese scholars have expressed their comments and the writings mentioning NATO, for example. Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, said NATO's transmission aims, quote, to move from tripwire deterrence to something which is more about deterrence by denial or defense. We are finalizing basically a new strategic concept that will be agreed at the NATO summit in June. And there, I expect China to be an important part. What do you make of EU's, the NATO's basically, almost like a focus on China?
Well, I'm just a humble professor, so I'm not a prime minister anymore, and I come from a country which is not a NATO member state. So it's difficult for me to comment. What I can say, however, is this: I think the NATO alliance has been revitalized because of the attack of Russia on Ukraine. So it went back to its original purpose as a deterrent towards an aggressive power called Russia. At the time in 1949, it was the Soviet Union. Now, what I think will happen in the world after this is that the line between war and peace will be blurred, and virtually everything can be weaponized. So you can use energy, technology, information, humans, and other things as a weapon. So I would assume that NATO looks at this age of unpeace in a more holistic fashion. How it then defines China in that package goes beyond me. I can only look at what the European Union has said on it.
Mm-hmm. Let's shift our attention a little bit beyond the big powers. For example, the impact of the war on the rest of the world, like Sri Lanka. What we have seen is this economic and political crisis. We have seen basically violent protest in Indonesia, for example, over this high rising cooking oil price. And then they see there's I think there's basically restrictions by Mongolia, the government, in terms of probably reducing the consumption of oil and gas in case there's a problem. So food crisis, energy crisis, and you see minerals from Russia, wheat from both countries, Ukraine and Russia. So they do have impact, in particular on developing countries, right?
No, it sure does. And, everything is related to everything in a globalized world where the value chains are very connected. Of course, the whole debate about value change was shifted, partially because of Donald Trump, partially because of COVID, and now partially because of Ukraine. So what I see is probably not deglobalization, but the regionalization of globalization. And we're to a certain extent back a little bit to the 1970s. Some of us, I don't remember, but I've read about the oil crisis and what the price of energy does to different societies around the world. You mentioned also the price of wheat. You look at a country like Egypt, which is highly dependent on Ukrainian and Russian wheat, and of course, subsidized bread. So there are going to be implications. And this is what a global community actually means. And that's why I think it's very important for political leaders to communicate the price of war.
On the short term, because of the pandemic, which is yet to be fully over, and now we have the war in Ukraine, do you see the global economy entering into recession?
Well, it's hard to say. I'm sure, I think the basic rules of world finance and economy have changed. If you remember, after the Cold War, it was all about market liberalization, right? And in China, you've had that ever since 1979 to a certain extent. So it was all about market, market, market. Now we're starting to see the state coming into the game in a different kind of way. We saw that with the financial crisis and the regulation of financial markets. We saw it during COVID, and now we're seeing it during the war as well. So the sentiment of the so-called Washington consensus doesn't exist anymore. It looks like, interest rates, it looks like money and inflation and loans and debt have taken on a completely new dynamic and understanding. So to talk about a global recession, I think is a bit early, but to say that this war will hit our welfare, whether you're Chinese or Finnish, I think is correct to say.
Mr. Stubb, let's focus a little bit on the China-Finland relationship. This year marks 72 years of successful relationship between the two countries. If you look at the numbers, like Finland's imports and exports to China increased by almost 50% and more than 12% respectively in January. So how do you characterize this relationship right now and into the near future, for example?
Yeah, on the diplomatic relationship, you'll notice that Finland was one of the first countries, right, to recognize and the diplomatic relationship. So we're very quick in reacting. And I remember in the conversations that I had with then Vice President Xi Jinping, when I was foreign minister, I met him in Beijing and in Helsinki. We talked a lot about the good diplomatic relations. Now, the way in which I would frame it is to say that China, it's great that you do business with Finland, but think of Finland as part of the European Union, right? So we are part of an equivalent internal market, which is the size, slightly bigger than China, about the size of the United States. So look at the business that we do with the European Union and then frame it into that. But Finland, of course, has a capacity, and we have a lot of technology. We have a lot of possibility for investment, and we're a very stable country. So in that sense, of course, putting a little bit of patriotic hat on, I say to my Chinese friends that, Finland is open for different types of business.
Thank you, Mr. Stubb. Thank you for your wonderful and insightful comments on this war and our relationship there.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
On that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our distinguished guest, former Prime Minister Stubb of Finland. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.